Good Sunday morning. I'm Stephen Briggs, and I'm grateful that you're here. Maybe you've got coffee nearby. Maybe you're getting ready for church or driving across town or just taking a slower breath before the week starts. I like this part of Sunday because the week hasn't fully taken over yet. There might still be a little space before the phone starts pulling, before the calendar gets louder, before Monday starts asking for answers. And that little space matters because a week can start pulling on you before Monday even arrives. There might be a decision waiting for you. There might be a conversation that you already know that you need to have. There might be something in the business that needs attention. And when you're carrying responsibility, it's easy to move straight into the strategy. But what's the plan, right? What's the fix? What's the next step? What needs to change? That's what we're talking about today. Mindset before strategy. And before we rush into the answer, I want us to slow down the thinking that's leading us there. Today we're talking about how the mindset that you bring into pressure shapes the strategy that you choose. Because before the plan, there's the thinking behind the plan. Before the next move, there's the condition of the person making the move. Right? And if we skip that part, we might still take action, but the action may carry something that we didn't mean to bring into it. So it might carry fear, it might carry frustration or hurry, or the need to control everything, the need to prove that we're capable, right? It might carry pressure that got dressed up and called strategy. And so that's why this phrase matters so much in my coaching. Mindset before strategy. And that doesn't mean that strategy isn't important. It doesn't mean that we sit around thinking forever while nothing gets done, right? It just means that the way that we're thinking is going to shape the way that we're planning. A rushed mind usually creates a rushed plan. A defensive mind usually creates a defensive response. A fearful mind usually creates a strategy that tries to protect more than lead. And a clear mind has a better chance of choosing the right next step. And so the question for this episode is simple. What thinking am I bringing into the pressure that I'm trying to lead through? That's a leadership question. But it's personal too, right? Because every one of us brings something into pressure. We bring assumptions. We bring old stories. We bring expectations. We bring habits. We bring things that we've been telling ourselves long enough that they start to sound like facts. And if we don't notice those things, we might end up leading from them. So today, let's talk about mindset before strategy. Not as a phrase to put on a slide, but as a way to walk into this week with a little more clarity. Leadership pressure can make everything feel urgent. A message comes in and your mind starts moving, right? You glance at the calendar and your shoulders tighten. You walk into one meeting while already thinking about the conversation waiting for you or after it. And so someone asks a question, and because you're already tired or stretched, you hear it as criticism. A plan change, and before you know it, your mind is building a whole story around what that change means. And so that's what pressure does. It speeds things up inside. And when things speed up inside, we usually reach for an answer. What should I do? What should I say? How do I fix this? What needs to happen next, right? Those questions aren't wrong. They're part of leadership. But they might not be the first questions that we need, right? Before I ask, what should I do? It might help to ask, what mindset am I doing this from? Because the same action can come from two very different places. You can have a hard conversation because you're clear and responsible, and you can also have that same conversation because you're irritated and ready to unload. On the outside, both might look like leadership, but underneath, they're totally different. You can change a plan because the plan truly needs to change, or you can change it because pressure made you impatient. You can say yes because it's aligned with the direction, or you can say yes because you don't want to disappoint somebody. And you can say no because it's wise, or you can say no because you're frustrated. And so the action might look simple. The mindset behind it tells a bigger story, though. That's the part that we often miss. Most of us don't stop in the middle of a normal week and say, well, let me check the condition of my thinking before I respond, right? We just respond. We answer the message. We send the email. We join the meeting, right? We make the decision, and we just adjust the plan. And sometimes later on, we realize that we weren't leading from the place that we thought we were. Maybe we were reacting to frustration. Maybe we were trying to avoid something uncomfortable, or maybe we just wanted relief more than wisdom. Maybe we were trying to prove that we had control. Or maybe we moved fast because slowing down would have forced us to feel the weight of the decision. I've done that. It'll show up in our tone. It'll show up in our timing. It'll affect what we say yes to, right? It'll affect what we avoid, and it'll shape what we tolerate. And it will also make us quit too quickly on some things and hold tightly to others. And so here's the tricky part. In the moment, a reactive mindset can sound very convincing. It can say you don't have time to think. It can say this needs to be handled right now. It can say you'd better protect yourself. It can say you can't let this happen again, right? It can say change everything. And sometimes there might be a piece of truth to that in the urgency, right? But urgency isn't always clarity. A fast thought isn't always a wise thought, right? A strong emotion isn't always an accurate read. So before we rush into strategy, we need a little space to ask what we're carrying. Maybe this week it's a team issue. Maybe it's a money decision, right? Maybe it's something in our business that isn't moving the way that we expected. Maybe it's a family conversation, or maybe it's the frustration of looking at your own goals and feeling like you should be farther along. Whatever it is, pressure rarely stays in one small area, right? It leaks. It follows us into conversations. It follows us into our decisions. It follows us into the plan that we think is separate from our mindset. And so that's why mindset before strategy is more than just a nice idea. If we don't notice what we're carrying, we're probably going to lead from it. Okay, so let's go deeper. Why does mindset come before strategy? Because strategy doesn't come from nowhere. A strategy comes from a person, and that person is thinking and feeling and interpreting and remembering and assuming, right? And reacting and deciding. So when we say, I need a better strategy, we might be right. But we also need to ask what kind of mindset is trying to build that strategy. A fearful mindset will build one kind of plan. A clear mindset will build another, though, right? A defensive mindset will enter a conversation one way, and a responsible mindset will enter it another. A scattered mindset will chase activity, where a focused mindset will look for the next right step, right? That's why two leaders can face the same problem and handle it completely differently. One leader sees a difficult conversation and thinks, this won't be easy, but it needs to be handled. And another leader sees the same conversation and thinks, this is going to turn into conflict, and I don't have the energy for it. So the issue is the same, but the mindset isn't. One leader prepares, speaking clearly, and handles the conversation, and the other delays and avoids and hopes the problem quiets down on its own. So the strategy didn't start with the calendar, it started with the mindset. Or how about think about a slow month in business? One person looks at the numbers and says, something needs attention. Let me look at activity or messaging or follow-up and consistency. And then another person looks at the same kind of month and thinks, nothing is working. Maybe this whole thing is going backward. Same pressure, but different inner story. One mindset investigates, the other spirals. One looks for a responsible next step, and the other starts collecting evidence for discouragement. That's why the mind matters so much. And so a lot of strategy gets built from interpretation, right? That's why relentless mindset rewiring is such an important part of the GRIT framework. The mind doesn't only produce thoughts, it creates direction. What we keep thinking eventually starts steering how we lead. And if I keep thinking that I have to carry everything, I'm going to probably build a strategy that depends on me too much. I might call it leadership, but it might actually be control. And so if I keep thinking that nobody is going to do it right unless I stay close to every detail, I'm probably going to struggle to delegate. And I might call it excellence, but it might actually be fear, right? And so if I keep thinking, though, that I can't afford to have that conversation, I'll keep tolerating things that slowly lower the standard. And I might call it patience, but it might actually be avoidance. Or how about if I keep thinking I'm behind, I might rush decisions that need a calmer look. And I might call it urgency, but it might actually be pressure looking for a relief. So that's the part that we have to be honest about. The issue isn't always about strategy. Sometimes it's the mindset that keeps producing the same kind of strategy. A person can change the plan and keep the pattern, right? They can change the calendar and change the meeting and change the software, change the process, right? Change the wording, whatever, change the offer. But if the inner pattern stays the same, the new strategy starts carrying the old mindset. A leader who avoids hard conversations can create a new meeting rhythm and still avoid the real issue. A business owner who overthinks can buy a new planner and still overthink the next step, right? A manager who doesn't trust the team can install a new system and still hover over every single detail. And even a person who reacts from frustration can learn better communication language and still deliver it with an edge. And so that's why some changes don't change much. The outside changed, the inside kept leading the same way. And I know that could sound discouraging, but I actually think it's hopeful, because if mindset shapes strategy, then working on mindset can change the quality of the strategy, right? When the mind gets clear, the next step usually gets clear. When the mind slows down, the response can become steadier. When the mind stops treating every problem like a threat, decisions can become more thoughtful. And when the mind stops rehearsing discouragement, action can become more intentional. And that's where intentional execution comes in. Mindset before strategy doesn't mean avoid action. It prepares us for better action. A clear leader still moves. A clear leader, right, still decides. A clear leader still addresses problems and has the conversation, right? The difference is that what drives the action. The leader isn't only trying to escape pressure, the leader is also trying to do what needs to be done. And that's a very different starting place. And so this is where I think people sometimes misunderstand mindset. They hear the word mindset and they assume that it means positive thinking. Just tell yourself it's fine. Just stay upbeat, right? Just believe it'll all work out. That's not what I'm talking about. Mindset before strategy isn't pretending pressure isn't real. It's telling the truth about pressure without letting pressure grab the steering wheel. It's being honest enough to say that this is hard and I still need to think clearly, right? It's saying this is frustrating and I still need to lead responsibly. And it's also saying, this just needs attention and I need to check the mindset behind my action. That's self-leadership, and it's practical, because the week ahead might bring things that you didn't plan for. A conversation that you didn't want, a problem that you thought was already handled, right? A delay that changes the schedule, or a disappointment that hits harder than expected. A moment where you're tempted to react quickly just to get the pressure off your chest. In that moment, mindset before strategy becomes more than just a phrase. It becomes a pause. And it's not because they make everything easy, it's because they bring your thinking back into the room before your strategy starts running ahead without it. So here's the clarity moment for today. You can't lead clearly from a mind that's reacting. You might still make a decision, right? You might still send the message or walk into the meeting or give an answer, but if your mind is reacting, clarity is harder to reach. Reaction makes everything feel close and loud. One comment starts sounding like the whole conversation. One hard day starts speaking for the whole week, and one problem starts feeling like proof that nothing is working. Or how about one person's response, and it starts carrying more meaning than it should, right? That's what reaction does. It shrinks perspective, and when perspective shrinks, strategy usually shrinks with it. A reacting mind wants relief. A clear mind, though, wants direction. A reacting mind wants control, but a clear mind wants the next responsible step. A reacting mind wants to settle the feeling quickly, but a clear mind is willing to slow down long enough to see what actually needs to happen. We've all had moments where reaction got the lead. We sent the email and later wished that we'd waited. We said the thing and realized our tone carried more frustration than truth. We changed the plan because we were tired, not because the plan was wrong. And we said yes because we didn't want somebody else to be disappointed, right? We said no, though, because we were irritated, or we even pushed harder because we felt behind. That wasn't my best response. That wasn't my clearest decision, right? That wasn't really about the issue in front of me. Again, this isn't shame, it's awareness, right? A reacting mind is usually trying to protect something. It wants to protect our image. It wants to protect our control. It wants to protect us from disappointment and from discomfort. And so the reaction might have a reason, it just shouldn't automatically get authority. That's where leadership grows. We learn to notice the reaction without handing it the microphone. We can say, I feel the pressure. We can say, I'm frustrated. And we can say, I'm tired. We can even say, I'm making this bigger in my mind than it needs to be. And then we pause long enough to choose a better next step. Not a perfect one, but a better one, right? That's what mindset before strategy gives us. It creates a moment between the pressure and the plan. A moment between what happened and what we decide it means. A moment between the first reaction and the leadership response. Sometimes that moment changes the whole conversation because a clear mind asks better questions. It listens better. It separates the person from the problem. And it can tell the difference between urgency and importance. It can act without needing to prove something, and it can be direct without carrying unnecessary edge. So before you reach for the strategy, check the mindset that's reaching for it. That might be the most important line of this episode. Before you reach for the strategy, check the mindset that's reaching for it. Because the mindset that you bring will shape the strategy that you choose. So let's make this practical. Picture a meeting that you're about to walk into. And there's an issue that keeps coming up and you're already irritated before anybody sits down. And so you haven't said anything yet, but your mind has. They're not going to listen. This is going to be a waste of time. I shouldn't have to repeat this again. If you don't notice that mindset, it's going to find a way into the room. It might show up in your tone. It might show up in short answers. It might show up in how quickly you shut down an idea. Or it might even show up in the way that your frustration becomes the center of the meeting instead of the actual problem. The strategy might be right. Maybe you do need to talk about accountability, right? Maybe expectations do need to be clear. Maybe the standard does need to be addressed, right? But the mindset behind that conversation still matters. If you lead it from irritation, people might remember the edge more than the expectation. If you lead it from clarity, though, you can still be direct. You can still say what needs to be said, and you can still set the standard. It just has a better chance of moving the work forward. And this also shows up in decisions. Something isn't working. Sales are slower. Attendance is lower. Follow-up has slipped. Maybe a process keeps breaking or the pressure starts talking fast. Change everything. Do something big. Fix it now. And so the issue isn't simply whether or not we change the strategy or stay the course. The issue is whether we are deciding from clarity. A clearer mindset asks better questions. What do I actually know? What am I assuming? What pattern am I seeing and what belongs to me? What's the next responsible action? Those questions, they don't weaken leadership, they clean it up. And communication is another place this shows up. Someone asks why a decision was made. Your first reaction might be defensiveness. You hear the question as disrespect, or you think that they should just trust me. But maybe they need context. Maybe they care about the outcome. Maybe they're trying to understand the direction so that they can follow it better. If your mindset is defensive, your strategy might be to shut down the conversation, right? If your mindset is clear, though, you might explain and listen and still keep the direction steady. Same question, different leadership response. And mindset before strategy shows up at home too, because pressure doesn't always clock out when we do. You might leave work carrying what didn't get solved, right? And then someone at home asks a simple question, your answer has more force than the question deserved. And that happens, right? It doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. It just means that you're carrying something and it needs attention. A mindset check could sound as simple as, before I answer, I need to realize that I'm still carrying that meeting. That kind of honesty can change the next sentence. And it also shows up when you feel behind. The week hasn't even fully started and your mind is already harsh. I'm behind again. I can't keep up. I should be farther along, right? This always happens. If that mindset takes the lead, your strategy might become frantic. You jump from task to task. You answer quickly, but you don't finish much. You confuse movement with progress, and you work harder without getting clearer. A steadier mindset might say, I feel behind, but I need to identify the next responsible step. That's a different direction. It doesn't deny the pressure. It just gives the pressure somewhere useful to go. That's where intentional execution matters. Intentional execution isn't frantic execution. It's not doing more just so that you can feel like you're doing something. It's choosing the next responsible step with enough clarity to stay aligned. Sometimes the next responsible step is making the call, right? Sometimes it's waiting before replying or asking for the numbers before changing the plan. Sometimes it's having the conversation that you've been avoiding. And sometimes it's just choosing one priority instead of trying to rescue the whole week in one afternoon. This is why mindset and action have to work together. Mindset without action can turn into overthinking, and action without mindset can turn into reaction. So together, though, they create clearer leadership. You notice the thought, you check the story, you choose the next step, and then you act. That's simple, but it isn't always easy. Because pressure has momentum, right? If you've been rehearsing a certain story for a while, that story is going to be available when pressure shows up. If you've been telling yourself that nobody listens, you're probably going to look for proof of that. If you've been telling yourself everything depends on you, you're probably going to lead like everything depends on you. And if you've been telling yourself that you're behind, then you're probably going to interpret ordinary delays as proof that you're failing. So this week, when pressure shows up, don't only ask, what should I do? Ask, what mindset is trying to answer that question? That one question can save you from a lot of unnecessary reaction. It can help you pause before sending the message. It can help you lead the meeting instead of carrying your frustration into it, right? And it can help you decide from what is true instead of what feels loud. And it can also help you take responsibility without taking on everything. And maybe most of all, it can remind you that leadership isn't only about the next move. It's also about the person that you're becoming while you make it. Okay, so let's take a sip of coffee and let's bring this a little bit closer. You know, it's easy to hear a phrase like mindset before strategy and agree with it quickly. It sounds right? It sounds helpful. It sounds like something that we should remember. But don't leave it there as an idea. Bring it into the week that you're actually walking into. What pressure is already waiting for you? Maybe it's a decision. Maybe it's a conversation. Maybe it's a problem that keeps circling back. Or maybe it's money or sales or staffing, family, right? Church or your schedule or your health or something that you haven't even said out loud yet. Name it for yourself. What pressure am I carrying into this week? And now ask the next question. What mindset am I bringing into that pressure? Am I bringing clarity? Am I bringing fear? Am I bringing frustration, right? Am I bringing discouragement? Or how about am I bringing the need to control the outcome? Or assuming that it's going to be harder than it really is? Am I already telling myself that it's all on me? Don't rush past that. The pressure might be real. The responsibility might be real, right? The decision may really matter. But the mindset that you bring into it is going to shape how you lead through it. And so now take another sip of coffee, right? Let's let that question settle for you. What thinking am I bringing into the pressure that I'm trying to lead through? That one question can change the week if you actually sit with it. So here's the practice for this week. Before you make the next leadership move, check the mindset behind it. That's it. Before the meeting, before the email, before the decision, before the conversation, before the correction, before the yes, even before the no, pause long enough to ask what mindset is driving the strategy. You might only need 10 seconds. Sometimes 10 honest seconds can change the tone of what's happening next. Okay, so you don't need a long process. Name the pressure. Name the mindset. Choose the next responsible action. That can be enough. Name the pressure in plain language, right? This conversation feels tense. This decision feels urgent. This delay is frustrating me, right? This problem keeps coming back, or this situation is making me feel behind. And then name the mindset. I'm assuming the worst. I'm trying to control the outcome, or I'm getting defensive. I'm rushing because I want relief, or I'm avoiding this because I don't want the discomfort, or I'm making one moment bigger than it needs to be. Again, no shame, just honesty. And then choose the next responsible action. Maybe you wait before replying. Maybe you ask one more question or look at the facts, or you set a clear expectation. Maybe you just apologize for your tone. Maybe you actually make the call, or maybe you choose one priority and you stop spinning through 5. That's intentional execution, not movement for the sake of movement, and not activity so that you can feel busy. A responsible next step that lines up with clarity. That's what we're after. Relentless mindset rewiring helps us get there because your first thought might not be your clearest thought. Your first assumption might not be true. Your first reaction might not be the representation that you want as the leader that you want to become. And so you practice a different direction. You catch the old thought, you question it, you choose a better next step, and then you do it again and again and again. And that's how the mind starts learning a new way to lead. You're not going to do it perfectly this week. There might be a moment where you react before you catch it. You might realize 10 minutes later that you were more frustrated than you thought. And you might even notice that after the conversation that the pressure was louder than clarity. That's still useful. Awareness after the moment can become awareness before the next one. And so don't throw away the practice just because you didn't catch it immediately, right? Use what you noticed. Ask, what was I thinking there? Ask, what story was I believing? What pressure was I trying to get away from? What would clarity have asked me to do? Those are growth questions. They help us lead our own thinking. So carry this line with you. Before you reach for the strategy, check the mindset that's reaching for it. And write it down if you need to, right? Put it somewhere that you're going to see before a meeting. Say it before the conversation. Use it before your response to the message. Because if the mindset changes, the strategy has a better chance of changing too. And when the strategy comes from clarity, the action becomes more aligned. That's the kind of leadership people can trust. Not because the leader has every answer, because the leader is learning to lead from a steadier place. So as we close this morning, come back to the main thought. Mindset before strategy. Before the plan, check the thinking. Before the decision, check the pressure. Before the conversation, check the story that your mind is already telling. Because you can't lead clearly from a mind that's reacting. And so this week, you might still have pressure. You're still going to have decisions to make, and you're still going to have conversations to handle and problems that need attention. But you can bring a different mindset into those moments. You can pause, right? You can notice. You can ask, what thinking am I bringing into this? And then you can choose the next responsible step. That's leadership. And here's why that little pause matters. Most of the pressure that we carry doesn't announce itself as pressure. It just shows up in the way that we answer, and the way we decide, and the way we walk into the room, and the way we start solving problems before we've checked the thinking behind them. So this week, don't try to overhaul your whole leadership style. Just notice the moment before the move. Before you send the message, before you change the plan, before you have the conversation, or before you react to what somebody said, give yourself enough room to ask one honest question. What mindset am I bringing into this? That question, it might not remove the pressure, it might not make the decision easy, but it can bring your thinking back into the room. And when your thinking is clear, your next step has a better chance of becoming steady and responsible and aligned with where you actually want to go. That's how mindset before strategy becomes practical. It shows up in one small pause, one clearer thought, and one better next step. I'll talk with you next week.